Debashish, I've always been fascinated by the kind of cultural possibilities of what people in the metropolis think of as so-called small towns. But we forget that the small towns had an important role to play in cartographies that have now disappeared. So whether they were railway junction towns or depot towns or towns with aerodromes in the pre-jet age of flying, there was a kind of cosmopolitanism that these places had, which we've now forgotten about. So from that point of view, could I draw you out on growing up in Chhapra and in Banaras? What were the kinds of histories that you inherited? What was the sense of landscape, of responding to landscape, and how did that play out in your art?
See, Chhapra was a very important place historically because the Dutch, the French, the British, the main center there was because of the saltpeter and the indigo thing. But later, I think post independence, it kind of lost it completely. And Bihar, if you see historically also where we were at the time of Ashoka, and I think from there, it kind of went back only. And while I was growing up, it was just a small town. And but being in railway, I think railway kind of keeps you very protected, and it's very a different kind of environment. It's so not we were not part of really the city because railway colonies are huge. Yes. And for the longest time, I think we were till the time we were kind of 12, 13, we were not allowed to go out even. So we were well within the colony, would play. So yeah, beautiful landscape. If I talk about, I still remember the kind of rain we used to get, and we had a huge window, and I used to sit there, and it was kind of open a different world. And our house was last because railway colony is kind of little away from the city, so our house was last, and beyond that, only the kilometers together was the green field, and I think it was very very beautiful memories I have.
But you've also talked about how when you went to Banaras, to your grandmother's house for the holidays, sitting on the ghat and looking out at the vista of the river and the particular kind of horizon that you have in that context, that gave you a certain sense of scale and light and sort of spatial possibilities. So could you talk a little bit about those experiences?
To me, Banaras was my second home because we almost exactly at the way you said, because my mother is from Banaras, and we used to go every year. At least would spend about 2 months, and during Puja, Dashera, and during summer vacations. And Ghat, our house was actually on the Ghat pretty much. It's Pandey Ghat, Ahilya Ghat is very close to each other, and so we would every day we would kind of come to Ghat to take bath for sure, and then we'll go up. So, and then I never thought that I'll come to Banaras for studies. And when I came to do my fine arts in the year 1990, and I spent 4 years in a hostel. But since BHU is kind of little away from the main city, but I could never spend, the moment I will finish college, I would come back. Everybody would go to, Marwari Seva Sangh for sketching, and people would go to Asi Ghat. But I would come all the way every day, 12 kilometers to Dashashwamedh Ghat to sketch. That was one thing I continued for 4 years. I came every day to sketch to the Dashashwamedh Ghat. And that time it was beautiful. At that time there was no this so-called Ganga Arati, which is a yeah, and it is really really there is no peace actually now at the Ghat. If you sit in the evening, earlier it was very peaceful. You go sit there and you see this beautiful they would do some what they call floating candles. Yes. The kids would sell. And people go and that pattern would create abstract patterns on the water. It was like a beautiful canvas. And we would, I think, the Ghat, if you do sit on the Ghat steps and if you draw the architecture of Banaras, I think that taught us a lot in terms of perspective, because it's very very difficult perspective because the angle it is about 45 degrees, steep. So it's very steep, especially Ghats like Chetsing Ghat. Yeah, Chetsing Ghat one is particularly, it's extremely, it is kind of protruding out. Yes. On the this thing. But I think Banaras was amazing. But Banaras, the best part about Banaras I always felt is the the mix of modern and the old. It's like Banaras is kind of its city paused at it looks like 18th century, 17th century, and then you turn and all of a sudden you see this modern Coca-Cola ad. So it's a beautiful blend of two. I think exciting.
Yeah, because one of my, I have to say, was a mentor figure, one of my closest friends who's passed away now, Richard Lanoy. He wrote an amazing book on Indian culture called The Speaking Tree. And he was devoted to Banaras. He also lived there. He used to be, for a while in the 50s, he was librarian at Rajghat, the Krishnamurti school. So, talking to him about Banaras and reading his book, I've had this tremendous sense of an urban fabric that, like you said, spans centuries and is very layered and very complex. I find that same kind of layered, palimpsest quality to a lot of the work that you do, including, for instance, the work that's right behind us here, where on the face of it, it looks like a portrait and material seems to be unusual. But if you look closely, it compresses meters and meters of cloth, of fabric, and they're bolts, they're unfolding. So there's a tremendous sense of compression in it. So I'm not saying this is conscious in any way, but I find in a lot of, particularly this work, there is a tremendous sense of hours, days, weeks, centuries of labor, of technique, of an attentiveness to material, which gets brought together in a very compressed, intense, powerful way. So, what was it that brought you to this world of textiles, particularly?
I think textiles. Number one, I've been working with textiles for the last 25 years. I work with a fashion house, and textile came naturally to me. But in general, if I think about textiles, I think I have lovely memories of because my ma, she would wear these beautiful cotton sarees and starched, and many times I have a very distinct memory of how the textile became part of us in terms of, especially I think I did mention once about this. It was Durga Puja, and we were coming from the temple to our home, and it started raining, and it's torrential. Actually, it was massive rain, and I started feeling out of breath. Actually, at one point of time, there was a huge land in between the railway track and our home, and I stopped, as if I can't breathe. So I still remember how Ma stood there, and she kind of tucked me inside her to this thing, and she was wet, absolutely, but the kind of warmth it gave me, and that feeling of I'm covered, I'm protected, and that I think textile, that a memory is very, very distinctly. I still remember, even during Mahalaya, and this, when this winter would kind of set in, and our woolens wouldn't be out, and Ma would kind of simply just pull out a sari of hers and just tie us around, and you could be safe, So those, and then even my brother, he would. We had a projector at home, Banaras made projector. We used to buy from Vishwanath Gali. It's very special, with those two things. One was boat. If you go to Vishwanath Gali in Banaras, you see these two boats running on a water, this thing, and a projector. So we bought a projector, and so my mother's saris were converted to a screen. So, and films were projected. So I think it's there. We always felt. And when I came here and started dealing with textiles, and I got into the detailing of textiles in terms of, I worked with a lot of weavers, sectors, and we Jaipur. Then I went to Gujarat, Kutch, and a lot of Odisha. I did a complete research with Ikat of Odisha textile people. So I think textile is very exciting, and I like the tactile feeling of it, and the immense possibility. It's like you are given two lines, this way and that way, and then you can create anything out of that. And the possibility of jacquard. I think this whole thing, it kind of plays in my mind, even when I'm doing layout. I think, I think about how this would be woven, and then I kind of weaving, printing, all textiles, all the techniques put together, and then I come up with my own concept. I think it does help.
Have you worked with the jacquard particularly? Because
Yes,
it's
Banaras.
you have.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
closely. I have I work with the weavers very closely. So I kind of sit with them, understand I sit in their karkhana, and I work with their jacquard technique, how they punch in, so how the repeats should be 7.5 inch by 7.5 inch. Yeah, it's very interesting to work with. Yes, I closely work with them.
Because it's interesting. On the one hand, that image goes back to the Upanishads, the warp and weft, the image of the cosmos. But it's also, I mean, jacquard particularly is a very early form of computing with binary code, with the punch card. So it's interesting how two very different worlds of, kind of mythic, metaphysical imagination and uh, something that's highly technical, they just come together in that act. So how do you reach out to these different worlds through your work? Because on the one hand, there's a strong component of research, of knowing the capacities of materials, and when I look around me at your recent work here, it also involves a great deal of, uh, frankly, physical awareness of what you can do with materials, whether it's putty or it's beads or certain kinds of paint or what we've been talking about a little earlier. Um, with this work particularly, the honeycomb, the spools. So I'm fascinated by the way you have that kind of very hands-on awareness, but also the way you reach out to symbolisms. Like when I first saw the work, the red and white work here, it instantly reminded me of the kind of sari that Bengali women wear on auspicious occasions. It's a very, yeah. So it's fascinating to see how you work at both these levels.
I think this came. I think this must have been in unconscious mind, and I don't think it's very conscious effort to, think the way you are looking at it. I think, and I don't plan so much from the beginning. So it's a lot of improvisation also. Like this one, I started this when I started this one. Actually, it was like my father was used to practice homeopathy, and so he used to have these glass bottles,
Right.
and this reminded me of that, and I started putting it together, and then how he would kind of keep the whole family till the time he was there. He kept the whole family intact. Everybody's in touch with him, and so this is completely, in this particular work is dedicated to him, and I see it's this entire growth is kind of unplanned, and still has a beauty or a planning in it, and this particular almira, which is kind of can't hold it complete, but still it's protected, and more like a museum piece.
Very much so. You have the idea of the vitrine, which should hold an artifact in, but the artifact actually exceeds it. It's like a honeycomb. It's got all this sense of cellularity, like a beehive. That's the kind of resonance the work carries for me, certainly.
Yes, actually, I still have a small piece, which I would show you another day. That that is what inspired me to create. It's actually the yellow bees, and one piece they had created there and it fell apart. So then I kept it for a long time, and then I started building this. But that was in my mind, so I think you connected very well. Yes, that is what it is.
And I'm also thinking we should include the third participant in our particular frame right now. Uh, it's from the minute I walked into your studio, I was startled by how the eyes of this portrait actually follow you around the room, wherever you are. There's a kind of movement. You feel that she's looking at you. But also, it's intriguing how the portrait itself shifts. It's not exactly an anamorphic image, but depending on the angle you're looking at it from, there's a wonderful disorientation of what otherwise is a straight portrait. So, like all the old masters, you've clearly there are processes of elongation and foreshortening here. Right? So, could I draw you out in this? Also, the technical problem of making a transfer portrait on an uneven and irregular surface. So how did you approach that? What are the mysteries of this image?
No, I thought when I started thinking, it's actually once again this since I was one work I was talking about my father, one talking about his mother, and whole the concept was about space and the family. So this was certainly my ancestors. That is how I looked at it, and the layers. It talks about it has the history of many generations, and if she's the one who's representing one image, if I say so, and certainly because I had not seen my grandfather. I always I lost. I think my mother lost him quite early in her life. So I remember I had a very distinct image of my Dida, my what you call my nani, and so that is where I tried to put. But this particular while making this, if you're asking, it's about it's quite a tricky one, and this has many layers we created, and then we have kind of woven through each layer, which is about 25 to 30 meters of each layer,
Right.
and they are kind of embedded in. But it was quite a task even for me. I didn't realize this is going to be that difficult while when I started planning it actually.
And it's a developing portrait. There's going to be more
It is going to be more. Yeah.
to this.
Still, I'm going to add out of it.
I'm also particularly fascinated by this set of 22 works, partly because the form of the circle is at once very traditional. It reminds you of the mandala. It reminds you of a certain kind of Victorian portrait. Also, you're using a kind of embroidery sampler a frame. So on the one hand, it speaks to all of that, but your actual images are based on the fold, the crimp. It suggests walls or textures. Again, the beehive. There's all kinds of forms of cycles, of different kinds of cycles of growth and decay.
This 22, actually, I spent about 22 years in Bihar. So the home which I've lost, if I say so.
Right.
It's very strange emotion because, railway quarters are home of many. So that home is there, which I called, and we didn't actually realize that. And for the longest time, I didn't realize that I'm going to move out of the city because my schooling was there. I had friends, and a lovely time, a very beautiful life. So when we moved out, and when I moved to Delhi, and then it had hit me really hard because Delhi was a very different kind of city, a cosmopolitan culture, and we grew up in a very small town. And then I went to BHU. BHU was kind of one notch above, but won't say it's a huge town. But also, it still had a very different kind of life. So these works are kind of my ode to those 22 years. So hence they are 22 portraits and portraits of time. And the textures are typically, I remember, in our railway quarters, they would paint every year. And so there'll be layers. They won't remove. Nowadays we kind of scrape it completely and then we start a fresh layer. No. So I would see, so then there'll be places pink, there'll be a green, so somebody who lived, so it's very interesting layering.
Right.
So I think that is where that inspired me. So these shapes, actually, if I think now, I remember my father used to work for Indian Railways, and I used to go to Loco Shade to see him at times. So when I would go and look for him, so he would come out of the steam engine front portion.
Right.
When he would emerge out of this thing, and there'll be beautiful, intricate kind of textures and patterns on his face. Yeah, with the carbon, thick layer of carbon. And I don't remember actually now what I felt that time, but it came back to me with, I think, this kind of, textures and this thing, a layered work.
But now maybe a little shift from family to your immersion for the first time in an academic context where you studied art. And I'm thinking of where you were, the BHU. Because normally when we talk about pedagogy in art in India, there's just a constant focus only on it might be Baroda, Shantiniketan, the JJ school. If you're lucky, people talk about Bombay, or about Delhi, the College of Art. And sometimes there's a reference to Trivandrum because of the radicals and so on. But I think there are many other centers that don't really get the kind of attention they deserve. So, what was it like studying art at the BHU at this moment when you had very interesting people who were either teaching or had come back to teach, where there was a focus on sculpture and on ceramics, and you were studying painting, but there was also an openness to these other practices. So, could you talk a little bit about that?
No, we were lucky that Balbir Singh Khat, he was teaching. He was head of the Department of Plastic Arts, and he became a dean later. So he was amazing. You know, he would not typically how the classes were taken in art colleges. So he would kind of advocate. He would talk more about Shantanikan style of teaching. So he would take us out. He would take us to the museum. We will sit out and talk about art together, not about art but everything else. And you know, he would kind of motivate. So we were really lucky to have him as our teacher. And then Madan Lal, he joined the same year when we joined in 1990 as a teacher of plastic art. But and we had we had Banerjee sir for graphics. He was also a very eminent artist that time. I think we've lost him now. But otherwise, typically, if I say in day-to-day Banaras college life, other than few teachers, we were not taught. We were not taught so much about think beyond the box. No, we were taught typically academically, and we'll have model studies and compositions and this thing. But I think much later, I think this shift happened when I started interacting with more professor than the students, and I think Balbir Singh Khat had a big role because I still remember I came to Delhi in year 1993. I think it was Trinale happened in Ravindra Bhavan.
The last of the Trinale editions.
Yes. So I came in, and then first time I went to Modern Gallery, and still remember the huge piece of Germination with Balbir Singh Khat, and then that was kind of pure abstraction and an amazing work, and that had about Banaras also. It had it's a huge sculpture, and it had a kind of small stone coming out, and and if you would water, it would kind of there was a path.
Right.
It would drip through. So it really inspired me, though I was doing a painting. But the whole concept of art, I think that changed me, that particular piece of Balbir Singh Khat. And it really inspired me a great deal. So I think the way I look at art now, he has a big role to play. Yeah.
And the idea of the museum has been strong for you in how you approached your work. So could you talk a little bit about that, particularly the previous exhibition, which dwelt on the museum as a trope? So where did that come from? How did that emerge?
See, very strange actually, because Chhapra, very little people know that about 30 kilometers from Chhapra, there is a Neolithic site called Chirand.
Oh yeah, of course.
And the mounds. Now, question is that while we were there at 22 years, I was not even aware of it. So when I moved out of this, and when I went to a museum here, National Museum, and I was looking at the Harappa and that thing. Then I started studying about it. Then I read about this particular one, and so I thought how little we are aware of. And then when the entire Indus Valley Civilization, if we talk about, I think only 10 to 15% has been actually excavated, and still all lies buried. So that is where that subject intrigued me, and I thought, let me work on this. So if you have seen that those were like 40 by 40 canvases, and in between the pieces were only by 8 by 8. So that whole empty land was also very metaphorically this thing that is all this whole thing is undiscovered, undeciphered.
Unattended to.
Absolutely. And how we even treat our heritage. I remember when I came to 1994 here in Delhi and Hodgkins village, At that time was hardly, now it is very well protected and looks very beautiful. Earlier, in that time, people actually lived there, looked like, and it was a thick carbon layer. They would cook in the monument and the beer bottles, and they would lie. So it was absolutely kind of, there was nobody to take care of these things. And we talk about heritage, and Delhi has so much, and India has, and Banaras also. If you go beyond Banaras, the city, if you go beyond, go towards Sarnath, in between the places, the on the road, you go to village and they say they worship a particular idol, and that idol must be 7th century, 6th century. They don't even know what it is, and they put sindoor, and it has become part of their life. They think it is their goddess, but actually that should be part of that should be part of the museum, the rich. So I really felt bad how we don't look after our heritage. And that entire collection and that entire series was kind of, I tried talking about this particular theme.
I'm really intrigued by that because I've, over the years, become very interested in the Stone Age. And I've started over about a year now, I've been doing this column called Lost and Found Histories for Open, the magazine. Yeah. So the very first one was actually about the Neolithic past. And because we're so obsessed with the Harappan period and the arrival of the Aryans, you don't actually see that there's a Neolithic culture across South Asia. And it spans across the Harappan period as well. So it's intriguing to look back at how we've had very diverse time horizons at the same time, but we don't look at these things. And like you said, many of the Neolithic sites are endangered now. In Kashmir, Burzahom, for instance, people are building roads through Neolithic sites. So
even very close from here, I think there is one site in Haryana, very close, Hisar.
Hisar, yeah.
They did recently. Even the village here, the Potter's village, Bulandshahr, they excavated a little bit. And overnight, I believe, whatever came out, the villagers looted. So that is what I came to know. So, yeah, I think we just don't know how to. But I think a bigger role, government has a huge role to play. I think in general also, in day-to-day life, parents would also have, they also have certain kind of responsibility because they take their kids to malls but not to the museums. Sunday they would go to a mall, but they should go to a museum because Sunday museums are open.
That's true.
Yeah, so, but that is, I think some kind of awareness is required in general, in public also.
So how do you, if you ever do you think about a potential audience for your works? Or who might your imagined unpredictable viewer be?
No, I create. I don't see, really, it's like if you talk about what we call Bihar Shakespeare, Bhikhari Thakur. So he created, he created an amazing poet, he's an amazing performer he was. And he was talking about theatre and this and that, very much ahead of time when nobody was talking in Bihar actually. And much later, I think this Indian Ocean, they took one song and he became very popular. Hilile Jagjor Dunya or something like that. It was very, but so I think, I think I create. I don't think much about it's heading which way or it's going to be finally getting an audience. I think I create. Somebody would, I think there are takers for everything and I think there is audience for everything, all kind of art form. It's like Esraj, it's kind of only what I think with Rabindra Sangeet, I think very few people play now, but that's a beautiful instrument. But still, and there are gurus who teach Esraj only. So I think beautiful things would stay.
Beautiful things will stay is a good way to conclude this particular part of the conversation. Thank you. It's been really a delight. Yeah.